The purple, bell-shaped flowers of the foxglove were a beautiful lie, a cascade of lethal elegance that Tamsin rendered in graphite with an almost reverent precision. She admired its poison, the quiet, dignified way it held its power. Over the rustle of her pencil on the page came the grating voice of Thornton Culver from the other side of the fence, a man whose every word was a violation notice. Ashcroft, that beast of yours is a clear disruption to the neighborhood's visual harmony. The metal of the mailbox was cold and hostile against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the humid afternoon air. Inside, nestled between catalogs for lawn furniture she would never buy, were the familiar envelopes. She didn't need to see the logo of the Sterling Glades Homeowners Association to know their contents. The paper was too glossy, the window on the envelope too precisely placed. Back inside the cool dark of her small house, she fanned them out on the kitchen counter like a losing hand of cards. A fine for uncontrolled proliferation of native weed species, her wildflowers. Another for failure to maintain uniform lawn height, her clover patches for the bees. A third, the most venomous, for harboring of a non-standard domestic animal. A heavy head pushed into her hand. Tamsin looked down into the warm, intelligent eyes of Fenrir and sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around his thick ruff. He was a Tamscan, a creature of breathtaking wolf-like beauty, and the HOA board saw only a threat. She buried her face in his fur, inhaling a scent of earth and ozone and the faint, clean smell of the rosemary bushes he loved to sleep in. He was the only real thing in this plastic world of manicured lawns and forced smiles. His solid, breathing warmth was her anchor against the tide of sterile perfection that threatened to drown her. The fines, the whispers at the community pool, the way his souled Culver would look at Fenrir as if he were a rabid stray. It all faded into the steady, reassuring thump of his tail against the hardwood floor. She let the violation notices lie, forgotten. Later, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, she called for him. The silence that answered was immediate and wrong. A cold dread, sharp and sudden as a shard of ice, pierced the quiet of her home. She found him in the back garden, near the fence line he shared with the Culvers. He was on his side, legs kicking in a frantic, spastic rhythm. White foam, thick and obscene, frothed at his lips, catching the last of the dying light. A choked, animal sound escaped Tamsin's own throat. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering, useless and trembling. His beautiful body was a taut wire of agony, his breath coming in ragged, wet rasps. Her gaze swept the grass around him, frantic, searching for a snake, a spider, anything. And then she saw them. Small, perfectly rolled meatballs, half-eaten, scattered in the grass. Tucked inside the crumbling meat of one, she saw the telltale fleck of pink. She picked it up, her fingers numb. It wasn't just pink. It was the specific, delicate shade of a flower petal. Oleander. Her mind, a catalog of botanical knowledge, supplied the information with brutal, clinical clarity. Nerium oleander. Cardiac glycosides. Every part lethally toxic. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. She recognized it instantly, not from a textbook diagram, but from the meticulously maintained, award-winning hedges that formed a perfect emerald wall around the Culver's property. The sickness receded, replaced by something colder, heavier, a dark, settling calm that felt like stone forming in her veins. His convulsions were weakening. His breath grew shallow. She wrapped him in a blanket, the sheer weight of him a dead, heartbreaking burden, and carried him to her car. The engine turned over, but as she threw it into reverse, her headlights illuminated the problem. A massive, gleaming white landscaping truck, Thornton Culver's landscaping and design stenciled on the side in aggressive gold font, was parked directly behind her, blocking her in. He left it there on purpose. A final, petty act of dominance. The sky opened then, a sudden, violent deluge of rain that hammered against the roof of her car. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound that mirrored the splintering of her own composure. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel, a raw, ragged scream tearing from her lungs, lost to the storm. He was dying, in her arms, and she was trapped, blinded by tears and rain. She stumbled out of the car, carrying her dying friend, and screamed into the maelstrom. "Help! Somebody please help me!" Her voice was swallowed by the wind and the rain. The pristine houses of Sterling Glades remained dark, their windows like closed, indifferent eyes. Despair was a physical weight, threatening to buckle her knees. Then a sound, the groan of ancient, rusted iron. Across the street, the gates of the Grieve estate, the sprawling, Gothic mansion that had been derelict for as long as anyone could remember, were swinging open. A figure emerged from the oppressive darkness of the overgrown grounds, stepping into the rain-swept street. He was tall, dressed in a way that was both timeless and utterly out of place. A long, dark coat that seemed to drink the meager light. He moved with an unnerving grace, the storm parting around him as if it dared not touch him. Tamsin froze, clutching Fenrir tighter. This was Lord Balthazar Grieve, the recluse the ghost story parents told their children. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, fixed on her, held a depth that felt ancient, bottomless. He stopped before her, his gaze dropping to the dying animal in her arms. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she felt a strange stillness settle over her, a pocket of silence in the heart of the storm. Without a word, he extended his left hand. From the cuff of his immaculate sleeve, he produced a small, ornate silver blade. In one fluid, economical motion, he drew it across the inside of his own wrist. Tamsin flinched, expecting a gush of crimson, but the blood that welled up was dark, almost black in the gloom. It did not drip. It clung to his skin, a single, perfect globule of viscous fluid. He knelt, bringing his wrist to Fenrir's pale lips. The single dark drop touched the dog's mouth and vanished, absorbed instantly. He then stood, his expression unreadable, and watched. Tamsin held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild counter-rhythm to the storm. For a long moment, nothing happened. The last, faint tremor in Fenrir's body ceased. He was still. He was gone. A sob caught in her throat. Then a shudder. A single, violent spasm ran through the dog's body. He took a deep, rattling breath, a sound that was impossible, a sound of resurrection. His head lifted from her arms. His eyes opened, but they were not Fenrir's eyes. The warm, familiar brown was gone, replaced by two burning discs of luminous, predatory amber, lit from within by a light that was not of this world. They were ancient, intelligent, and utterly terrifying, and they were looking right at her. The silence that followed Balthazar's departure was a physical presence in the house. It settled into the floorboards and clung to the curtains, heavier than dust. Tamsin sat at her drafting table, a fine-tipped pen clutched in her hand, but she wasn't drawing. She was listening for the sound of a world that had tilted off its axis and not yet settled. She expected sirens, shouting, the frantic barking of neighborhood dogs. Instead, there was nothing but the placid hum of suburban twilight. The utter normality of it was a special kind of madness. Hours bled into one another. She tried to work, to lose herself in the familiar whirls of a fern frond or the menacing curve of a pitcher plant's lip. But her hand betrayed her. The lines were jagged, uncertain. Her art, usually a sanctuary of control, now reflected the tremor in her soul. Then came a sound, a single, deliberate scratch at the back door. Not the frantic scrabbling of a wounded animal, but a sound of quiet insistence. Measured, patient. Tamsin's heart seized. She rose from her stool, each footstep a conscious effort, the wooden floor cold against her bare feet. She reached for the doorknob, her palms slick with sweat. She expected to find him broken, a prize for the bargain she had witnessed. She opened the door. Fenrir stood on the welcome mat, perfectly whole. His coat was immaculate, not a speck of dirt or blood on the thick, gray fur. He wasn't panting. He wasn't whining. He simply stood there, regarding her. And his eyes... Tamsin recoiled, a gasp catching in her throat. The warm, intelligent amber she knew was gone. In its place were two pools of liquid silver, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence that had nothing to do with the dim porch light. It was the color of moonlight on a frozen lake. He stepped inside, his movement unnervingly fluid. It lacked the bounding, clumsy joy she associated with him. This was a different creature wearing her dog's form, one that moved with the predatory grace of his namesake. He ignored the water bowl she kept filled by the door. He walked past the worn chew toy lying in the hall. He proceeded directly to the living room's bay window, the one that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the Culver's pristine two-story colonial. He sat, perfectly erect, his gaze fixed on the house across the street. He didn't move. He didn't blink. "Fawn," Tamsin whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. He didn't react. She crept closer, extending a trembling hand to touch his back. His fur was cold. Not cool, but cold, as if he had been lying in a snowbank. A deep, unnatural chill that seemed to leach the warmth from her fingertips. She looked into his silver eyes and saw an intelligence that frightened her more than any wound could have. It was ancient, patient, and utterly devoid of the simple, loyal affection she had known. He was an instrument now, Balthazar had said. An instrument of what? She was only just beginning to comprehend. And he was pointed, like a weapon, directly at Thornton and his soul Culver. The next morning, Fenrir hadn't moved. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Hemlock Lane, and he remained at his post, a silent, silver-eyed sentinel. Tamsin had spent a sleepless night on the couch, watching him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach with every passing hour. She needed an anchor, a piece of the old world to cling to. She needed science, reason. She called Dr. Moss's clinic, her voice a strained imitation of normalcy. "I think he might have gotten into something yesterday," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "He's acting very strangely." The vet clinic was an island of sterile brightness, all clean tile and the antiseptic smell of rubbing alcohol. It was a world away from the creeping, gothic rot that had infested her own. Dr. Quillen Moss, a man whose face was a roadmap of gentle kindness, greeted her with a warm smile. "Let's have a look at the big guy, shall we?" he said, ruffling Fenrir's fur. He paused. His smile faltered slightly. "He feels a bit cool." Fenrir allowed himself to be led into the examination room without protest. He stood on the cold steel table with the same unnerving stillness he displayed at the window, his silver eyes taking in the room with a calm, assessing gaze. Dr. Moss began his examination. He checked Fenrir's teeth, his ears, felt his lymph nodes. Tamsin watched, her hands clenched in her lap, praying for a diagnosis. A parasite, an infection, anything that could be named and treated and explained away. Then Quillen pulled out his stethoscope. He placed the diaphragm against Fenrir's chest, his brow furrowed in concentration. He moved it again. He took the earpieces out, checked them, and placed them back in. A deep line appeared between his eyebrows. "Tamsin," he said, his voice low and puzzled. "Come here." She approached the table, her legs feeling like lead. "Listen," he said, offering her the stethoscope. She hesitated, then put the earpieces in. He placed the cold metal disc against Fenrir's ribs. She heard nothing. Not the steady, rhythmic thump-thump of a healthy heart. Not the frantic flutter of a heart in distress. Just an absolute, profound void. A cavern of silence where a vibrant life force should be. She pulled the earpieces out, her face pale. "There's nothing," she whispered. "There's nothing," he confirmed, his professional calm cracking at the edges. "No heartbeat, no respiration. His capillary refill is instantaneous. His body temperature is a full 10 degrees below normal, yet his tissues are vibrant. He's the picture of health. It's impossible." He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, looking from the dog to Tamsin and back again. "I ran the blood panel you asked for, just to be sure. The toxicology report came back half an hour ago." He turned to his computer, clicked a few times, and swiveled the monitor toward her. A list of chemical compounds filled the screen. One was highlighted in red, oleander glycosides. The concentration in his system, Quillen's voice was barely a whisper. Tamsin, this is enough to induce cardiac arrest in an animal 3 times his size. It wouldn't have just made him sick. It would have been instantly fatal. There is no medical explanation for him to be standing here on this table. The clinical words hung in the sterile air, more terrifying than any curse. A man of science had just confirmed she was living in a ghost story. He was looking at her with a mixture of confusion and a dawning professional fear. He was seeing the impossible, and she was the one who had brought it into his clean, orderly world. I don't understand, she stammered, the only truth she had left. She left the clinic with Fenrir walking silently beside her, the printout of the toxicology report clutched in her hand. It was a death certificate for a creature that refused to die. The rational world had officially abandoned her. She was adrift in Balthazar Grieve's ocean now, and the tide was pulling her inexorably toward the shore of his choosing. 2 days later, the invitation appeared. It wasn't slid under the door or left in the mailbox. It was propped against the door itself, a cream-colored rectangle of thick, embossed cardstock held in place by a single, perfect white rose. You are cordially invited to a neighborhood unity barbecue. Let us reaffirm the bonds that make Hemlock Lane a community. Hosted by Thornton and Isolde Culver. It was a summons. A public stage for a play she hadn't auditioned for. Tamsin's first instinct was to burn it, to lock the doors and pretend the world outside her 4 walls didn't exist. But call to Balthazar quickly disabused her of that notion. You must attend. His voice came over the line, smooth and cold as polished marble. They are building their own scaffold. It would be a pity not to witness the final act of its construction. What's going to happen? She asked, her voice small. Justice is not a thunderclap, Miss Ashcroft, he replied. It is a slow, creeping vine. It finds the cracks in the foundation and, over time, brings the entire structure down. You are merely a spectator. Go, watch the vine grow. The day of the barbecue was unnaturally perfect. The sky was a vast, cloudless cerulean, the sun a benevolent warmth on the skin. The Culver's backyard had been transformed. Rows of pristine white tents were erected on the impossibly green lawn, shielding tables laden with food from the sun. The air hummed with forced joviality and the sizzle of meat on a gargantuan stainless steel grill, manned by Thornton himself, clad in a crisp white apron that read Grill Master. Tamsin felt every eye on her as she walked through the gate. The whispers followed her like a physical wake, the neighbors smiling at her with their mouths but not their eyes. They had all heard about Fenrir, about his miraculous recovery. They saw her as an anomaly, an unknown variable in their carefully curated equation. Isolde Culver, looking brittle and immaculate in a lemon-yellow sundress, intercepted her by the potato salad. Tamsin, darling, so glad you could make it. We were all so worried about your poor dog. The emphasis was a stiletto heel, aimed right at her. He's fine, Tamsin said, her voice tight. He's very resilient. She saw Balthazar then. He hadn't entered with the other guests. He simply was there, standing near the ancient oak tree that marked the edge of the Culver's property, a figure of absolute stillness dressed in dark, tailored linen. He was a shadow in the midst of all the garish sunlight, and his presence was a gravitational pull, ordering the chaos around him. He met her gaze from across the lawn and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Spectator. The word echoed in her mind. Thornton Culver clapped his hands for attention, his voice booming with false bonhomie. Friends, neighbors, thank you for coming. In times of confusion, it's important to come together, to remember who we are. As he spoke, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The light turned golden, syrupy. The shadows of the great oak tree began to stretch, growing longer and sharper than they should, like grasping fingers reaching across the lawn. The smoke from the grill, thick with the smell of charring fat, did not rise and dissipate. It hung in the air, a greasy, gray haze that coiled and eddied in the still air. Balthazar, still by the tree, raised a hand. It was not a grand gesture, merely a slight, elegant turn of the wrist, as if he were conducting a silent orchestra. And the show began. The smoke swirled, coalescing against the stark white canvas of a nearby picket fence. An image flickered into existence, ghostly and ephemeral, like a heat mirage. It was Thornton, his face twisted in a sneer, speaking into his phone. The sound was just a murmur on the wind, but the projected words, formed from shadow and smoke, were undeniable. Foreclose on the Millers. Teach them a lesson about property values. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, a sweet elderly couple from down the street, stood frozen, their faces ashen. The image dissolved and another formed. This time it was Isolde, in her dressing room, mocking Susan from number 12, her imitation cruel and precise. The shadows mimicked her preening, her disdainful laugh echoing as a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Susan burst into tears. One by one, the private cruelties of the Culvers were painted in smoke and shadow for all to see. Their malice, their gossip, their petty tyrannies, all laid bare. The cheerful chatter of the barbecue had died, replaced by a rising tide of angry, shocked whispers. The neighbors weren't looking at the fence anymore. They were looking at Thornton and Isolde, their faces masks of judgment. Thornton stood by the grill, tongs hanging uselessly from his hand, his face purple with rage and disbelief. "It's a trick," he bellowed. "Some kind of projector. It's her." He pointed a shaking finger at Tamsin, but no one was listening to him. All eyes were on Isolde. She stood by the food table, her perfect hostess smile frozen on her face. A bead of sweat traced a path through her foundation. She felt the weight of their collective stare, the public dismantling of her carefully constructed world. She raised a hand to her head, a gesture of pure, panicked nerves, and ran it through her immaculate blonde hair. A thick lock of it came away in her hand. She stared at it, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. The hair was limp, lifeless. She touched her head again, frantically, and another, larger clump pulled free from her scalp, revealing a shocking patch of pale skin beneath. A woman near the salad bar screamed. Isolde let out a choked, animal sound. The second clump of hair fell from her trembling fingers, landing with a soft, obscene little splash directly in the center of a large bowl of glistening potato salad. The facade of neighborhood unity shattered into 1,000 pieces. The barbecue devolved into chaos. People were backing away from the Culvers as if they were lepers, their faces a mixture of fear and disgust. Tamsin slipped away in the confusion, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't look back. She could still hear Isolde's thin, ragged screaming as she ran. Paranoia, once planted, grew with the speed and tenacity of a noxious weed. In the days that followed the disastrous barbecue, Hemlock Lane became a neighborhood of drawn curtains and suspicious glances. The story of the phantom projections and Isolde's sudden, horrifying alopecia had spread like a virus. The Culvers were social pariahs, but the fear they had inspired was now a free-floating entity looking for a new place to land. And it landed on Tamsin. She was the outsider, the quiet illustrator with the strange, cold-eyed dog, the one who was seen speaking to the unnerving man who lived in the old Grieve house. The whispers started small, theories concocted over coffee and phone calls. She was a tech genius, using sophisticated drones and projectors. She was a witch. She was a government agent sent to destabilize their community. The theories grew more outlandish with each telling, fueled by the primal fear of the unknown. Tamsin felt it every time she stepped outside. The way conversations would cease as she walked past. The way children would be hurried indoors. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. And through it all, Fenrir sat at the window, his silver eyes never leaving the Culver house, a silent, patient testament to the power that had been unleashed. For Thornton Culver, the public humiliation was a wound that would not stop bleeding. His reputation was destroyed. His wife was a hysterical shut-in, refusing to leave her darkened bedroom. He had lost control, the one thing he valued above all else. His rational mind, incapable of processing the supernatural, searched for a logical explanation, a tangible enemy. And it settled, with the full force of his broken ego, on Tamsin Ashcroft. She had gaslight them all. It was the only explanation. It was a coordinated attack, a technological illusion designed to ruin him. Tamsin was sketching a datura flower, its trumpet-like bloom both beautiful and deadly poisonous, when she saw the motion across the street. It was well past dusk, the sky a deep, bruised purple. Thornton Culver stormed out of his front door, his face a grotesque mask of fury in the twilight. He wasn't carrying a briefcase or a golf club. He was carrying a red, 5-gallon can of gasoline. Tamsin's blood ran cold. He didn't hesitate. He marched across his own perfect lawn, across the asphalt street, and onto her property. He moved with the terrifying purpose of a man who had nothing left to lose. Tamsin was frozen at her window, a silent spectator to her own impending doom. She heard the unscrewing of the cap, a rough, plastic squeal in the quiet evening. Then came the sloshing sound, and the sharp, acrid smell of gasoline hit her, seeping through the window frame. He was dousing her porch, the wicker furniture, the climbing roses her grandmother had planted, their petals now dark and glistening with fuel. He was methodically, hatefully preparing a pyre. He finished emptying the can, tossing it aside with a loud clatter. From his pocket, he pulled a small cardboard book of matches. His hand shook, not with fear, but with righteous, consuming rage. He tore one free. Tamsin could see his lips moving, cursing her, condemning her. He swiped the match head against the striker strip. It failed. He did it again, a vicious, scraping sound that cut through the night. A tiny, perfect orange flame sputtered to life, a malevolent star held between his thumb and forefinger. It illuminated his face, a hellish, distorted vision of suburban vengeance. He held it up, preparing to cast it down and burn out the rot he believed she had brought into his perfect world. The slosh of gasoline was a liquid threat in the heavy twilight air. Tamsin watched from her living room window as Thornton Culver marched across his unnaturally green lawn, a crimson plastic can in his hand. Every step was a declaration of war. The setting sun caught the angry flush of his face, turning his skin the color of a fresh bruise. He was not just angry. He was unhinged, a king whose borders had been violated, marching to burn the offending province to the ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the rhythm was different tonight. It was not the frantic, fluttering beat of a trapped bird. It was the deep, resonant thud of a war drum. The fear that had lived in her stomach for months, a cold and coiling thing, had been burned away, replaced by a strange, hard calm. The click of her front door latch was a gunshot in the suburban quiet. She stepped onto the porch, the old wood groaning softly under her weight. A solid warmth pressed against her leg. Fenrir. He moved with her, a shadow of gray and black fur, his body low to the ground. A growl vibrated deep in his chest, a sound not of fear, but of profound, territorial challenge. He was a wolf at the gates of his den, and she was his pack. Tamsin rested a hand on the dense muscle of his back, the contact grounding her, rooting her to this small patch of earth she would not surrender. Thornton stopped precisely at the property line, as if some invisible fence still held meaning. His face was a contorted mask of rage. "You think you can just ignore the rules?" he spat, his voice cracking with a high, manic energy. He unscrewed the cap of the can, and the acrid stench of fuel flooded the air, sharp and nauseating. "You and that beast. This is a community of standards, of order." He was shouting about grass length and paint swatches, but his eyes screamed of something far uglier, a terror of anything he could not control. Her silence, her dog, her very existence was a weed in his perfect garden, and he had brought the poison. He fumbled in his pocket, producing a cheap plastic lighter. CHCHK. The scrape of the flint was brutally loud. A tiny, defiant flame sputtered to life, a cruel orange star in the deepening dusk. It danced in his pupils, reflecting a miniature inferno. This was it, the final escalation. He lunged forward, the can tipping, a clear stream of gasoline splashing against the lowest step of her porch, dark and slick on the painted wood. And then the world stopped. The frantic, electric hum of the cicadas ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The gentle breeze whispering through the sycamores died, leaving the leaves hanging in absolute stillness. It was a silence so total, so profound, it was a physical pressure against Tamsin's eardrums. She saw it before she understood it. The shadows. The long, deep shadows pooling beneath Lord Balthazar Grief's ancient, sprawling oak trees began to move. They did not stretch or fade with the dying light. They peeled away from the manicured lawn, coalescing like spilled ink, flowing inward from all directions. They gathered behind Thornton, rising, thickening, weaving together into a single, towering form that blotted out the last of the evening sky. Balthazar. But it was not the elegant, reserved man she knew. This was something else entirely. Something elemental. He was sculpted from twilight and cold, ancient fury. His suit was the black of a starless midnight, his face a pale mask of aristocratic wrath. His eyes were not eyes. They were twin voids, pits of cold starlight that held the memory of dying galaxies. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply was an anchor of absolute authority dropped into their petty world. Thornton, blinded by his own small rage, saw nothing. He was still trying to bring the lighter's flame to the gasoline-soaked step. The ground beneath his feet shifted. Tamsin saw the turf ripple, the blades of grass trembling. The world held its breath. With a sound like 1,000 roots tearing through dry earth, the lawn erupted. Thick, thorny vines, the color of dried blood and rusted iron, burst from the soil. They were not the soft, green climbers of a garden. They were woody, barbed, and alive with violent intent. They whipped through the air with an audible hiss, wrapping around Thornton's ankles, his knees, his waist, pulling taut with bone-snapping force. A wet, gurgling scream was ripped from his throat. The gaskin flew from his grasp, clattering onto the grass, and spilling its contents harmlessly into the soil that was now his enemy. The vines were unyielding, a living cage. They yanked him brutally upright, his expensive loafers sinking into the lawn as the ground softened to receive him. He thrashed, his hands clawing at the thick, unbreaking tendrils, but it was like fighting iron bars. Then the transformation began. It started at his feet. The florid, angry red of his skin leached away, replaced by a pale, mottled gray. The change crept upward with horrifying speed, a tide of petrification consuming him. The texture of his skin shifted, the soft flesh hardening, pitting, becoming coarse, rough stone. He was being calcified, fossilized, turned into a monument of his own hatred. His screams became a choked, gargling rasp as his throat and tongue hardened. His mouth froze, locked open in a permanent, silent howl of disbelief and terror. His eyes, the last part of him to turn, bulged with an awareness that would never, ever end. They fixed on the perfect, beige facade of his own house, a paradise he had built and was now forever banished from. He was being planted, rooted in the very earth he had lorded over. In seconds, it was over. Thornton Culver was gone. In his place stood a statue, a grotesque, screaming sculpture of a man, his body twisted in a final, futile struggle. A permanent, petrified resident of Culver Court. The world crashed back in. The cicadas, released from their thrall, screamed into the night, their chorus of frantic, panicked symphony. The air, thick with the smell of gasoline, ozone, and freshly turned earth, felt thin in Tamsin's lungs. Everything was moving again. The wind in the trees, the flicker of distant streetlights. Everything except the thing on the lawn. Balthazar was gone. The shadows were just shadows again, empty and inert. Tamsin's legs finally gave out. She didn't fall so much as fold, sinking onto the top step of her porch, her hands still tangled in the thick ruff of Fenrir's fur. The dog, her steadfast anchor, whined softly and began to lave her hand with his warm tongue, grounding her in the horrifying reality of the moment. She stared at the statue, at the silent scream etched into its stone face, and felt nothing but a vast, hollow emptiness where her fear used to be. The first siren was a distant wail that grew into an ear-splitting shriek. Red and blue lights strobed across the houses, painting the tranquil suburban street in the lurid colors of chaos. Two police cruisers screeched to a halt, their tires tearing at the asphalt. Officers emerged, weapons half-drawn, their faces tight with confusion and adrenaline. They saw the spilled gas can. They saw her, a lone woman, sitting on her porch with her dog. And then their flashlights found him. Their beams played over the stony figure, tracing the impossible contours of his frozen struggle. Tamsin heard their clipped, disbelieving voices over their radios. Subject is unresponsive. Is that a statue? Get paramedics here. Now. The front door of the Culver house burst open. Isolde, drawn by the sirens, rushed out, her silk robe flapping around her. Her eyes, wide and searching, darted from the police cars to Tamsin, and then, finally, to the center of her lawn. Her scream was a blade. It was a raw, visceral sound of a mind tearing apart. She ran, stumbling on the perfect grass, to the base of the statue. "Thornton!" she shrieked, her voice shattering. She clawed at the stone, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the cold, rough surface, making a sound like scratching slate. "Thornton, what did she do to you?" She whirled, a trembling, accusatory finger aimed directly at Tamsin. "She did this. Her and that monster." The paramedics arrived, their faces grim and professional until they put their hands on the statue. One placed a stethoscope against the stone chest. His eyes widened. He looked at his partner, his expression one of utter medical bewilderment. "I have a pulse," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "It's faint, thready, but it's there." They were touching a living man encased in a shell of his own making, his heart beating a slow, trapped rhythm within the stone. He was catatonic, breathing, but gone. A medical impossibility that would haunt their reports for years. This new horror was too much for Isolde. Her accusations dissolved into a frantic, paranoid babble. "It's watching me," she sobbed, backing away from her husband's frozen form. "Don't you see? The statue, its eyes are watching me. They follow me." The police officers exchanged a look, the universal glance that communicates deeply disturbed. They moved in gently, flanking her, speaking in low, calming tones. They were guiding a woman in the throes of profound shock, a woman whose husband had inexplicably turned into a lawn ornament. Her ravings about the watching statue echoed down the street as they led her to a waiting ambulance. The doors slammed shut, the sound as final as a gavel strike. Slowly, the chaos receded. The emergency vehicles departed one by one, their lights disappearing around the corner, leaving behind an unnatural quiet. The neighbors' windows were all lit, rectangular yellow eyes staring out into the night, but their blinds were drawn tight. The unspoken consensus of Culver Court was to see nothing. The street was the same as it had always been, with one addition. One grotesque warning. Tamsin remained on her step, the cool night air a balm on her feverish skin. The trembling had finally started, a deep, seismic shudder working its way through her bones. It wasn't fear. It was the aftershock, the release of a pressure that had been building for months. She lifted her head and looked across the pristine, wounded lawn to the grand house next door. He was there, a silhouette on his second-floor balcony, framed by the dim, golden light of his study. He wasn't looking at the statue or the lingering scent of official panic. He was looking directly at her. Slowly, with the gravitas of a king acknowledging an equal, Lord Balthazar Grieve inclined his head. It was not a nod. It was a bow, a gesture of respect from one sovereign to another, a silent compact sealed across the darkness. Tamsin returned the gesture, a small, weary dip of her chin. A wet nose nudged her hand, and she looked down. Fenrir sat patiently beside her, his amber eyes clear, intelligent, and calm. He looked up at her, and for the first time since they had moved here, he let out a single, soft, healthy woof. It wasn't a bark of alarm or a whine of distress. It was a sound of pure contentment, of peace. She buried her face in the thick fur of his neck, inhaling the familiar, earthy scent of him. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Tamsin Ashcroft took a full, deep breath. The poison was gone from the air. Justice, ancient and absolute, had been rendered. The quiet that settled over her small house was not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of sanctuary. From a distance, the street looked perfect again, a tranquil suburban scene, bathed in the gentle glow of moonlight. But on one perfect lawn, a stone man screamed silently at the sky, his eyes fixed forever on the home he could never enter again, a permanent, immovable warning. This was a story about the rotting foundations of petty tyranny, and the primal justice that awakens when the wild heart of a good person is pushed to the edge. It's a reminder that every kingdom, no matter how small, has its breaking point, and some weeds, once pulled, can never grow back. If you were captivated by this tale of suburban darkness and the triumph of the untamable, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more stories that explore the shadows hiding in plain sight. We'd love to know what you think is going through the stone mind of Thornton Culver right now. So leave your thoughts in the comments below.